When I was in college, a buddy of mine and we decided to auction ourselves off at a local auction. And what you got if you were the winning bid is you got to spend an afternoon with us out on the lake. We borrowed my mom's boat at the time, and we took some people out on the lake and did some inner tubing with them and had a great time. And we spent 4 or 5 hours with this family that ended up winning, towing them around behind the boat on inner tubes and all that kind of fun stuff. And we got to the boat dock, and we dropped off the family, and we were getting ready to go load the boat up. And my buddy and I, we just kind of looked at each other, and we're like, we didn't get a chance to tube today. Now, you got to understand, all right, like I was 19, 20 at the time, all right, but I was responsible, okay? And so my mom allowed my buddy and I to take the boat out, and most Sundays after church, you'd actually find us out at the lake in the afternoons, and it was a ploy that I may or may not have used to draw my wife to me. The lovely Audrey Farrington enjoyed the lake. Anyways, so we kind of looked at each other, and we had this moment where it's like, man, it's the middle of the week. It's like 5 o'clock at night. Nobody's out here yet. Like it's empty. We'll be safe. Like we won't do anything too crazy, but we didn't get a chance to inner tube today. So let's just you and I do it. Like, I know we don't have a flagger. You're supposed to, but no one's out here. It'll be okay. We'll be safe. We'll keep a good eye on each other. And so we went out and we did some inner tubing. So we did this inner tubing, and my mom had this big, like 6-foot wide inner tube you could fit like 2 or 3 people on. Well, we like to ride it just one person, because you could lift it and you could ride it, and you can ride up and over people at times, but you could also use it and you could get the air underneath it. You could get some great air off of the jumps. And so it was my turn to be out there riding the tube. And so here I am, I'm on this tube, and my buddy throws me outside of the wake, and I'm leaning on the left side. I pick up the right side a little bit to make sure that I'm sliding across the water. And all of a sudden, I don't know what happened, but it just happened so fast. As I'm sliding across, the right side of the inner tube hit a wave, and it did this teeter-totter launch. Boom! And I went flying. I mean, I picture it in my mind every time I think about this story. I looked down as I was going up, and the boat kept getting smaller and smaller as it was going away from me. I kid you not, I counted to probably 8 or 9 before I hit the water. And as I was helplessly flying through the air, the thought, besides counting, that's going through my mind is, oh, this is going to hurt. When I hit the water, being this high and come down, I've got to be in some type of position to brace myself for the landing that's about to come. I was desperate to make sure that I didn't get flipped around, landed in some awkward way. Like I was in this moment of desperation where I was praying to God that I was going to, 1, come up alive, and 2, come up without any broken bones, because I had heard fables in my family that my mother actually cracked some of my dad's ribs in retaliation for what he had done to her when he had launched her pretty high. So there was some competitive nature in my family, and I'd heard these stories, whether or not they were true. I heard them, and I was just imagining that all in the split seconds in my head. Now, we've all been there. Maybe not flying through the air like that, but we've all been in a moment of desperation. A moment where we're clinging and hoping and praying that whatever it is we're going through, we're going to be all right. We've all faced those moments of desperation. And so that's what the title of the message today is Moments of Desperation. We're beginning a series today called The Benefits of Being Stuck. The benefits of being stuck. You see, in life, whether you're flying through the air because you got launched off of an inner tube, or maybe you're stuck in a job that you hate, or you feel like you can't get out of a situation that you're in the middle of it, and you're waiting there, waiting for that next thing to come, and all you feel is helpless, hopeless, and stuck. But it's in those moments of desperation where Jesus is working and moving. Even though we may not see it, we may not feel it, he's got a plan, and his timing is perfect. So there's a story in the book of 1 Samuel, the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel, chapter 1, about a woman named Hannah. And Hannah was in a moment of desperation. She was in a challenging season, and she had been in this season for what seems like an incredibly long time. And so we pick up Hannah's story in verse 2 of 1 Samuel chapter 1. It says, Elkanah had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of heaven's armies at the tabernacle. The priests of the Lord at that time were the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would only give her one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time, Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. Why are you crying, Hannah? Elkanah would ask. Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? Hannah has what we all have. Problems. Hannah has problems. She had problems so big that she was getting desperate. She was desperate to overcome those problems. She had problems in her world. Her world, the society that she lived in at the time, it was a complete mess. It was a cesspool of a pit of depravity and corruption. People had slipped into an immoral and lawlessness and abusive time, violent, compromising, and they permitted many different things. The depth of their moral decay went so far as you could see it in the gang rape that took place. You could see it in the homosexuality, in the wife abuse, the children abuse, the injustice, the idolatry, the greed, the civil war that took place in this world that she lived in. Her world was a mess. It was a world that would make you question whether or not you would actually want to bring children into it. Her world was sick. And so is ours. There are earthquakes, floods, droughts. There's bombings at daycare centers. There's AIDS, which is tragically taking many lives while our media continues to talk about consensual sex. The Bible, manger scenes are being tossed out the back doors of schools while people are continuing to bring in safe sex through the front door. Identity is no longer determined at birth. Countries are making nuclear bombs that shouldn't be. Our world is sick as well. Hannah had problems in her home. Her husband had 2 wives. Peninnah, the other wife, her name means pearl. I'm sure that Hannah didn't think of her as a pearl. I'm sure Hannah thought of her as that grain of sand stuck in the oyster, that irritation that was there, because Peninnah, man, she kept popping babies out left and right. And here's Hannah unable to have any children at all. And in her time, in society back then, if you were unable to conceive a male child, it was actually considered to be a curse from God. We've got trouble in our homes. There's a constant drive to have more, and it's put moms and dads in these jobs always seeking to do more, and what they want to do at night instead of engaging in conversation with their kids is just put them in front of the TV hoping that they're not going to leave so they can just have a moment by themselves. 1 in every 3 marriages ends in divorce. Teens have pressure from school sports or other extracurricular activities, that they miss out on being kids these days. The family unit is under attack and being divided. Hannah's stuck in a mess. She's been waiting and waiting. This waiting had went on for years. It had gone on so long that because she couldn't produce a male offspring, or any child for that matter, her husband decided to go and marry another gal who could produce the offspring that she was unable to produce. And she continued to have kids. And if you know that kids don't just randomly pop out, it's a process of development. And so she had been waiting for years. She's been waiting. She's desperate for something to change, something to be different in her life, desperate to be unstuck, to be unhindered from this situation she's in. And so she does something that she's probably done many times before, as she goes to the tabernacle. But now she's desperate. And desperate times call for determined measures. Desperate times call for determined measures. Hannah, she goes to prayer, but it's different than I would imagine that she's prayed in the past. It's a little bit different than that, because each year she goes to the temple, remember? Each year they would go up to, the tabernacle, and she was reminded each year that she doesn't have kids. And so this year she goes and she prays with a deep, determined focus. And in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9, it says, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance to the tabernacle, and Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow, verse 11, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. Hannah can be seen in contrast from other women biblical figures throughout Scripture who struggled with infertility. People like Sarah, people like Rachel, who instead of taking their problems to the Lord, decided to try and solve their problems of infertility by themselves, and they brought in other women to produce the thing that they were trying to produce and couldn't produce by themselves. And so they brought these other women in, a solution that brought a whole lot more grief than the honor that they were looking for. Instead, Hannah, she turns her sorrow and her deepest desires over to the Lord. And Anne Marie Anderson, she writes this. She says, Hannah trusted God with her hopes and dreams. She trusted him with her wants and disappointments and emotions. Hannah shows us that we can honestly express ourselves to God. At her most desperate, at her most anguished moment, Hannah turns to God in prayer. She reaches out in prayer. And in verse 19, we skip down. It says, the entire family got up the next morning and they went to worship the Lord once more. Then they returned home to Ramah, where Elkanah slept with Hannah. The Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. Skipping down to verse 27, Hannah says, I asked the Lord to give me this boy, and he has granted my request. Now I am giving him to the Lord, and he will belong to the Lord for his whole life. And they worshiped the Lord there. Church, can I tell you this? That God answers prayer. Amen. God answers prayer. From the beginning of human history, no matter the distressful circumstance, the sorrow, the agony, the anguish, the discouragement, the grief, the hurt, the pain, no matter the problem or the trouble, God always answers the prayers, and he's met the needs of his people. Amen. And he'll meet our needs when we're gripped by sorrow. He'll meet our needs when we're brokenhearted. No matter what trials, no matter what temptations we may face, God will always answer our prayers according to his will. Now, let me clarify that. I didn't say that God will answer the prayers that you want him to answer. right? I said he'll answer the prayers according to his will. Not what we want, but what we need. And he knows what we need. Hannah had a problem. She was denied something that she desperately wanted. Hannah's childlessness, it led to two tragic events or effects. The first one is it clouded her whole outlook on life. The Bible, it says that she was bitter. It says that she wept often. It says that she wouldn't eat. It says that she was downhearted. And in her prayer to God, she spoke of her condition as being in misery. And yet that's how we live our own lives at times. How tragic when we're so burdened that we're unable to experience the simple joys that enrich our lives. You see, Hannah's depression was so great that she could not even recognize the evidences of God's grace in her life. Hannah had no child, true, but she had a husband who loved her desperately, a husband who was sympathetic to the trials that she was facing. We can sense the love that Elkanah had for his wife Hannah when he says, hey, I understand, but I didn't mean more to you than 10 sons. Now, just for the record, men, I would encourage you, don't say it like that when your wife is going through a hard time. Don't I mean a lot to you? Take it from someone who's tried that before. It doesn't always go the best. But his heart was in the right place. And yet so often, when we feel bitter, when we feel downcast, we're also unable to sense the good gifts that God has given us. We're unable to sense the evidences of the love, of the grace that God has in our lives. There are going to be times in your life where you don't understand what God is doing, where it doesn't make sense. If you looked closely at verse 5 in chapter 1, it says, and the Lord had closed her womb. It's something that we skip over a lot. And the Lord had closed her womb. You read that and you're like, what are you doing, God? Like, she wants a kid. Why would you close her womb? Why wouldn't you allow her to have a child? Why wouldn't you allow her something that she desperately wanted? The prophet Isaiah gives us the answer why. In Isaiah 55, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord. And my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. It may sound a little flippant, it may sound a little cruel, but when I think of the fact that God closed her womb, I look at that and I say, isn't it cool that from the very beginning, God had a plan? We often take the negative things that come in our life and we look at it through a negative lens. But from the beginning, God had a plan. A plan that might have never happened if she had a child like every other woman in society that she lived in. A plan that might have missed what God was trying to do. The challenge is that when life is hard, we feel stuck. And when we feel stuck, it doesn't feel like God has a plan. It doesn't feel like anything's happening because we're stuck in the middle. It feels like the world is against us. It feels like our friends are against us. It feels like our family is against us. It feels like our employers are against us, our friends, our relationships. It feels like everybody is against us. But what happens is that some of our greatest prayers come out of our deepest pain. Some of our greatest prayers come out of our deepest pain. Hannah has this huge problem. And she goes to God in prayer. She takes her problem and it drove her to pray. And I'm sure that Hannah had prayed many times before because it was a yearly thing that they would do and they would go to the tabernacle. But now she's in a moment of desperation and she became determined to do something different. She was desperate for change. But here's the thing about change. Things can't change until you change. until you change your perspective, until you change your heart posture, until you change your attitude. The Lord had closed Hannah's womb. Catch this. The Lord was the source of Hannah's problem. The Lord was the source of the problem that she had. Have you ever considered that some of the problems, some of the trials, some of the struggles that we face in life are given to us by the Lord? He allows good things and bad things. And yet, when the bad things come, the first thing that we want to do is we want to blame somebody else, or we want to blame the devil. It's their fault. It's his fault. That's why we're having this. That's why I'm having this difficult time. But what if you changed your perspective and you said, what if God is trying to get my attention? Because oftentimes God does this stuff to us, and he's simply looking for us to call out to him. Just like in Psalm 107, it says, Lord, help. They cried in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He calmed the storm to whisper and stilled the waves. What a blessing was that stillness as he brought them safely into the harbor. Sometimes the things that we see or perceive as a heartbreak is actually God's way of beginning a breakthrough. What's the purpose inside the problem that you're facing? What's the purpose inside the trial that you're coming up against? You've been praying for stuff, and yes, it's coming, but it's dressed like a problem. And what if you saw that problem as a harvest? What if you saw that problem as a harvest? What you call a problem, heaven calls a harvest. Heaven calls an opportunity. And sometimes the only way for God to show you his power is to let you encounter a situation that only he can bring you through. You know how you've been asking God to change you? You've been asking God to make you a better child, a better husband, a better spouse, a better employee, a better person. God, I need you to do this in my life. I want you to change my heart. What if God is using the hardest things in your life right now to do in your heart the thing that you've been asking him to do all along? Far too often we're facing difficult situations when we're in our moments of desperation, and we run from them. We run from the problems. We run from the trials. We run from the battles. The thing about it is, when you run from the battle, you run from the blessing. When you run from the problem, you run from the promise. When you run from the struggle, you run from the success. When you run from the trial, you run from the triumph. When you run from those things that God sometimes will place in your life, you run from the things that he's trying to bring you into. And maybe God isn't punishing you. He's preparing you for something different. Someone needs to hear this today. That God is preparing you for what he prepared for you. God is preparing you for what he prepared for you. There's something in your life that you're running from, something that is hard, something that is painful, something that you just want to get out of. Something that doesn't make sense, and it's pushing you to your limit. And God is there saying to you today, I'm with you in the pain, and I want to deliver you into the promise. It says that the Lord closed Hannah's womb, but it also says in verse 19, the Lord remembered her plea. Now we think of that word remember, and we're like, well, God forgot about her. No. That way that the word remember, when it's talking about God in this sense of the word, it suggests the initiation of a miraculous saving act of God. There's other instances in these moments where God remembered throughout Scripture. It was the first step in providing the divine help that God was about to give to his people. You look at the intervention of the life of Lot in Genesis chapter 19, the life of Rachel in Genesis chapter 30, or the Israelites in Exodus chapter 2. To remember means not simply to think about someone, but to act on their behalf. The time had finally come for what God was going to do next. And Debbie McDaniel, she writes this. She says, we can be assured that God definitely had a plan. In every situation, his time is perfect. Samuel needed to be born at a crucial time in history, not sooner, not later. He needed for Hannah to be at a place where she was willing to allow Samuel to be brought up by Eli and be raised as a priest. God's purposes, she says, were far greater than only granting Hannah her desire for a baby. One of the main things that I love about this passage is how God interjected, how God overruled. Because if Hannah had had a son earlier than when she was about to have that son, he wouldn't have been placed in the temple at Shiloh. He wouldn't have had the opportunity to be raised as a priest, and he wouldn't have had the opportunity to become a prophet for God. There is a purpose for what God does, and his timing is perfect. But it all started with a desperate woman facing a moment of desperation, praying a desperate prayer. And the prophet Jeremiah says this, if you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. If you look for me wholeheartedly, if you seek after me, if you pray wholeheartedly, you will find me. The Lord hears the prayers of those who call on him. In the good times, in the bad times, if we seek him, we will find him. It's been said that the presence of trouble doesn't prove the absence of God. Meaning, no matter what's going on around you, God is with you. No matter what trials, what struggles, what seasons, what stuckness you're in, God is with you. And yet we live in a day and age of instant gratification. When we go through times of waiting, it may feel like God's late, but God doesn't operate on our time. God doesn't operate in our time frame. At every moment of our day, God is working out his divine plan. Even if we're unaware of it, he is moving in our midst. One author writes this, they say, in our natural human impatience, at times it may seem like God is late, but he always provides what we need when we need it. And maybe later than our comfort zone prefers, but God does not leave us in the lurch. He may simply stretch us and challenge us to rely more fully on him by trusting his timing. And those moments of desperation, those moments of life when you feel stuck, those moments when you just need to keep moving forward, when you're unsure of what's going on, they cause us to be determined to seek God with all that we are. And when we seek God with all that we are, he will reveal himself to us. Because sometimes your clearest view of God will be in the middle of your deepest trials. Sometimes you will get the best picture of the love that God has for you when you are in the deepest, darkest pit of your life. And the light of God is shining forward and shining through. And when you experience God in a life-changing way like that, you had better give him some praise. You had better give him some praise. Let your problems lead to praise. Let your problems lead to praise. Hannah had a problem. She prayed about it. God provided for her. And then she praised God. You can read that prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. It is an incredible song of Hannah, this poetic prayer of thanksgiving that she shares with God. When it feels like you're stuck, when it feels like God isn't moving, trust that he's always working, even when you don't see it. Because Job 34:20 reminds us that we know God is working behind the scenes. We know that he's working behind the scenes. The same Hannah who is bitter, downcast, that she couldn't even sense that God's grace, now saw the Lord clearly. She experienced him. In fact, she was able to praise God in a situation where some might expect her to go back into despair. Because she had been so desperate to have a child. She then has a child, and guess what she has to do with that child? she has to give it up. She has to say, Jesus, I made a vow to you, and so I'm going to follow through with what I said, and I am giving this child back to you. 3 years old was around the time when they were weaned, and she said, God, at 3 years old, he is yours for the rest of his life. And what could have brought her back into despair because she had no kids, now was a moment of rejoicing for her, because what I love about the story of Hannah is the way that God works. As Hannah had 7 children. And if you know, Hannah was barren, which means there was a big goose egg. She then has 7 children, and the number 7 is the number of completion. What an interesting way that God works and uses Hannah, who was in despair, to now sing the praises of God. You see, prayer is the answer. Prayer is the answer to stressful circumstances. When we're deep in desperation and our hearts are broken, prayer is the answer. When we're gripped by anguish, agony, grief, hopelessness, helplessness, prayer is the answer. When we're sad, downcast, discouraged, disheartened, prayer is the answer. Amen. Simply stated, no matter what the trouble or problem, no matter the situation or circumstance, no matter the trial or tribulation, prayer is the answer. In your moments of being stuck, in your moments of desperation, prayer is the answer. And prayer is the answer because prayer is powerful. When you attach Holy Spirit power to prayer, walls come falling down. Those pits that you've been living in get filled right up. Those trials that you are facing get washed away. Prayer is the answer. Would you pray with me?